So when so now recording is in progress. I'll just repeat what I just said, which is to welcome all of you and anybody else who's watching this at a later time. Wendy, should I say something about myself?
Yeah, why don't you?
Okay. So my name is Dan Cozort. I started studying Buddhism academically in 1978 at the University of Virginia. Um, I didn't go there because they taught about Tibetan Buddhism. It just so happened I was in Charlottesville because I'd followed my girlfriend there, and Tibetan Buddhism is what they were doing, and I didn't really know that much about the differences between one kind and another, so I just thought I would try it out. And as it happened, it was it was difficult, a lot of studying to do, a lot of memorizing to do. And I might have quit if it weren't for the Lamas, who turned out to be really amazing people. We always had one in residence at the University of Virginia. They would come over and be given the title of visiting assistant professor. And then they would get a salary, but the salary would go to their monastery in India. But that was very helpful. But anyway, they were there to teach us graduate students and to some extent the undergraduates too. But even though they were exiles who had lost their country and were monks who owned no property, and every bite of food they ate, came because somebody donated it. They were the happiest people that I'd ever met. And they were very wise, very compassionate, very kind, and very smart and happy. And so I just thought, I got to keep going with this because they know something that I should know. Anyway, I went to India um, to study further. All of us graduate students did that. We would work on translation projects. Then we would go to India to find Tibetan scholars with whom we could study and learn the oral tradition on these texts. There was traveling around India, and I went to a lot of people and asked questions. And sort of towards the end of all of that, I got two audiences with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and it was like an hour and a half each. So
Wow.
about 3 hours of question and answer with His Holiness. And he was really the best of all of them. Um, he's a very learned person, even though he has a lot of other things that he always had to do. He's very smart. He's very warm. He's very down to earth. And because he had this much experience with Westerners, I think it made him more able than most to understand what it was I was trying to get at when I would ask him a question. Sometimes others would misunderstand, and we'd have to back up and, try again. Um, so that's very precious to me, this time that I got to spend with him. And then after that, I got my degree. I taught briefly at James Madison University as a part-timer. Then I got a full-time job at Bates College in Maine, but it was a temporary job, 2 years. And then I got my job at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is where I taught for whatever, 35 years or something like that. I retired a couple of years ago. My wife, Bethany, spent 23 years here in Ithaca, and until she moved to southern Pennsylvania to be with me. And I promised her that when I retired, if she wanted to, we could move to Ithaca. So that's what happened about a year ago. And
Wow.
we're living up at Kendall. So my association specifically with Namgyal Monastery goes back to its beginnings, really, because um, Namgyal Monastery is here largely because of the efforts of Sidney Pyburn, who who graduated from Cornell and lives in Ithaca. He and Jeff Cox started a publishing company called Snowlion Publications, and my master's thesis was turned into a book which was one of the first Snow Lion books. It was called Highest Yoga Tantra. That really helped me get my kind of academic career started. I published 5 things altogether with Snow Lion, 4 books and 1 videotape. And the videotape was I had monks from Namgyal Monastery of Ithaca, New York, come down to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and make a sand mandala in our art gallery. This happened on 2 occasions, and on the second occasion, in 1995, I think it was, we filmed everything, and then with a colleague, we put together a film, and Snow Lion distributed the film for us. So I go back a long ways with Namgyal. A couple of times in the 1990s, I came up here to Ithaca to give talks at Namgyal when it was still on Aurora Street. And then, as you probably know, they built the temple up on the hill above Ithaca College in about 2010. Is that right, Wendy?
About
About that, something like
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah.
And now they've built this magnificent great 14th Dalai Lama Library and Learning Center, below that. And so we saw both the temple that's higher up and the library that's lower down. So today I thought you saw these things, but you might benefit or like to have a little background on a couple of things, and then an opportunity to ask questions too. So I've got some images I'd like to show you, and I'll talk over them. I just want to explain more about the 14th Dalai Lama, who he is, and about the Kalachakra, which is what the upper temple is all about. So I'm going to try now to share my screen. So can everybody see this now?
yes.
Yeah.
The land of Kalachakra, Namgyal Monastery. Yeah, so I'm actually going to start though with the Dalai Lama, just this is kind of the overall thing. So this picture of the Dalai Lama is from a Time magazine of April 1959.
Wow.
In March 1959, um, because there seemed to be an attempt by the Chinese to imprison the Dalai Lama, there was an uprising in Lhasa, and that's when he decided to escape to India. So, with his family and a group of other people, he disguised himself as a layperson, and under cover of darkness, they snuck out. And it took a while for them to get to India. So I think that maybe this April something 1959 is published while he was still en route, or maybe after he shortly arrived in India. Anyway, it goes way back. But what is the Dalai Lama anyway? Well, I'm putting here he's an ordinary human being, but one who is also an emanation of the Bodhisattva Chenrezi. So Tibetans refer to him as Chenrezi. The Sanskrit is Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara is a famous Bodhisattva or Buddha to be in Indian Buddhism. Bodhisattva is defined as one who has the altruistic aspiration to become a Buddha. In other words, you want to become a Buddha because that way you can be ultimately helpful to the most people. And Chenrezi is almost a Buddha. So he's supposed to be the emanation. But what does that mean exactly? Well, it seems to mean that he perfectly embodies the wisdom and compassion of Chenrezi, not just that he is this celestial figure who can, boom, manifest a human body. And it comes out this way. It doesn't really matter that one way or another, but maybe you could think of him as being regarded as a saint. So the way you depict Chenrezi usually is in this four-armed version right here. This is a picture of the statue that you find in the library up at Namgyal. So Chenrezi has 4 arms. The 2 center ones hold a jewel that grants the wishes of all people who are suffering everywhere. And the right hand holds a mala, a rosary, which, is just something that people use to count prayers or mantras. Um, Mantras are, I'll explain this a little more later, are short utterances that encapsulate the essence of a particular person, like here Chenrezig represents compassion. So his mantra is Om Mani Padme Hum, and that encapsulates the essence of compassion. And then the other hand is holding a lotus flower. And bodhisattvas are always shown like they're royal personages, dressed up like a prince or a princess, depending on which gender they are, whereas Buddhas are usually depicted as being monks. Um, Chenrezig also has a 1,000 armed form with 11 heads. And the depiction on the left was done by a Western artist named Alex Gray. And I just want to point out a couple of features of it. First of all, you see that there are these different faces representing these different heads. The top one, as you see, is very different. It's a fierce face. Um, it's a feature of Tibetan Buddhism is that all of these gentle, compassionate, loving beings also project a fierce form, which is meant to protect people who need protection, and to represent the transformation of anger, jealousy, hatred, and so forth into positive qualities. So anyway, you can see that there are lots of implements in the various thousand arms of this bodhisattva. There's also an eye in the palm of each hand. So all the better to see all of us who are suffering everywhere. Then if you look at the picture of the right, you can see that the Dalai Lama has this 1,000 armed form superimposed over him to indicate that he actually is the emanation of the Bodhisattva of compassion. And in the background, the Potala Palace where the Dalai Lama lived. In the upper temple, in addition to the image of Chenrezig, we also saw White Tara, who is a female bodhisattva who is also a symbol of compassion. And she actually has many different forms, 21 of them altogether. And so that's why in the shelves around her, there are statues of these other forms that she can take. I also wanted to point out another statue of the Dalai Lama, which is in the library in the upper room, which is called the Great Room. And this statue, which is on the right, is made in exactly the same way as the painting, which is on the left, which I believe is in one of the paintings or tankas that are in the library down below. Anyway, I learned recently that the statue on the right was actually made here in Ithaca on Etsy Street by a Tibetan artist. Um, it's a beautiful, very lifelike rendering. And it's on the left side, or rather on the right side of the Buddha, and on the left side, I believe, is a statue of Chenrezig, who he is supposed to be the emanation of. Okay, so the Dalai Lama is a tulku, that is to say, a reincarnate lama. So a lama is just the Tibetan word for guru. So a lama is someone recognized as the child of as a child, recognized as a child of being the reincarnation of a famous teacher. Or, you can acquire the title Lama during your lifetime through earning the respect of others. So it was estimated that in Tibet, there were about 3,500 lines of tulkus, of which the Dalai Lama is the most famous. I don't know how many lines of tulkus are still being kept going these days, because identifying these children who reincarnate as these famous teachers is more difficult now that a lot of Tibetans are living in exile from Tibet itself. The picture is of the Dalai Lama at about the time he was recognized which was when he was about 4 years old, and he was living way up in an area, a remote area of Tibet called Amdo. But there's a long story about how they found him, but when they found him, this is what he looked like. And about the Dalai Lamas themselves, well, the name Dali actually means ocean, and it means ocean in Mongolian. So it's a Mongolian word, and it happened at a time when uh, Altan Khan was the ruler of Tibet and China. I mean, you remember the Mongolian hordes, right, who um, controlled much of Asia in the middle of the this previous millennium. Anyway, the fifth Dalai Lama became the leader of Tibet in 1642, and after that point, Dalai Lamas became the rulers of Tibet as well as being high spiritual leaders. And this Potala Palace was constructed during the tenure of the fifth and sixth Dalai Lamas. Um, a little footnote here is that the fifth Dalai Lama died while this was still under construction, and the regent, fearing that construction would stop, in other words, that money would no longer be donated for this purpose, if people knew that the fifth Dalai Lama was dead, actually concealed his death for 17 years. He just kept saying, "Oh, His Holiness is in retreat and can't be disturbed." And this went on and on and on. And finally, he fessed up and said, "Okay, well, you know, the Dalai Lama's dead." And then they looked for the next Dalai Lama, but of course he was already like 17 years old, and he wasn't really so sure he wanted to be a Dalai Lama. That's another story too. Now, in the library, as we went in, you might have noticed to the left this large painting on the wall. It depicts, the smaller part is a map of Tibet itself, and on it are images of some of the events in the life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But there's a lot more than could be contained within that map, so they're spread all over the outside. Now, each of these things actually has a caption under it, so you could tell what it is, but all the captions are in Tibetan. One of the things I would like to do is to make a guide for people so that they would know in English uh, what all these things were depicting. But just for these are some of the things that are depicted on this map. That in 1935 he was born in Amdo. 1939 he was discovered and brought to Lhasa. 1950 he was made the leader of Tibet. He visited Mao and Zhou Enlai in Beijing in 1954. He earned his Geshe degree, kind of his doctorate in philosophy, in 1959. And not long after that, he escaped from Tibet. It also has some events like 1987, making this peace plan to members of the U.S. Congress. Um, in 1988, proposing the uh, to the European Parliament in Strasbourg um, a plan for Tibet. 1989, winning the Nobel Peace Prize, and in 2011, transferring his temporal power to democratic leaders. So those are some of the things that are depicted. And this is an example of one of those pictures. I picked it because on the left, we can see that His Holiness is at Congress, the United States Congress, and is getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And in the little museum next to the library, or part of the library, but to the left of the main room of the library itself, there are copies of medals that the Dalai Lama got, including this medal and the medal for the Nobel Peace Prize. Anyway, I told you that I met him and got these teachings from him in 1984. And afterwards, his private secretary, who is actually his brother, who I got to know pretty well, took this picture of us together You can see that we're basically the same height, but he's got a much bigger head. And this is the statue outside of the library that I'm sure you remember. Very lifelike statue, and he's holding his heart in his hands there. While we're looking at this picture, though, I'd like to point out that if you look to the right and up, you can see that just below the roof is our depiction of two deer, and they're looking up at something. And that something is actually a wheel with eight spokes. This is a very common Buddhist symbol because the Buddha taught an eightfold path to enlightenment. And he did it in a park outside of Sarnath in India, which is referred to as the deer park. So deer listening to him. Okay, so that was the end of what I wanted to say about the Dalai Lama. And you can ask me some questions after this gets done if you want to. But I also wanted to point out what's going on in the upper building, which is called Dukor Chuling, or the place where Kalachakra is taught about. So Kalachakra is a particular practice done within Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism is very, very rich in different kinds of practices that people can do depending on their inclination or what their teacher thinks would be good for them, um, or lots of other kind of factors. Many Tibetans get initiated into many, many practices, but they only actually try to do a few. So anyway, Kalachakra practice is something that has been associated with the Dalai Lama for centuries. And he teaches it, does Kalachakra initiation to groups sometimes of 100,000 people at a time. Most of the people are not going to do the practice. They think it's a blessing to be given initiation into it by the Dalai Lama. And so they just take it that way. They don't promise they're going to practice it. So I just wanted to say something about what was going on up there because uh, this is a mandala that's made out of colored sand. This is a copy of the mandala that is up there under glass in the Kalachakra temple and also under glass down at the library. Anyway, a mandala is a map of the entire cosmos. It's two-dimensional, but you're meant to imagine it three-dimensionally, and I'm going to show you some pictures of three-dimensional renderings of this. Anyway, the center is a square, always, and that represents the palace in which a particular Buddha lives. The name of this Buddha is Kalachakra, uh, which means wheel of time. Um, and, so that's a Sanskrit name. Dukor is the Tibetan for that. This palace has 5 levels. This is unusual. Most of them only have one. And in it are over 700 deities or different figures of different types. This is also very unusual that there would be this many. The Kalachakra mandala is by far the most complex of all the mandalas that Tibetans make. So what does it all represent? Well, here are two pictures of how to look at it. Um, the different levels or different rings represent the different elements. So there's the bottommost one is the element called space, the lack of obstructive contact, which is what most of the cosmos is made of, right? Actually, when you get down to the atomic level, it's what most everything is empty space. On top of that is a disk of fire. On top of that is a disk of water. And on top of that is a disk of earth. And of course, we live on top of the earth and we know about the water. And we know that underneath the earth and the water is fire, that um, the earth has a molten core. And then the palace and everything is on top of that. Well, according to Buddhist mythology, there is a mountain at the center of the world called Mount Meru, and it is in shape like an inverted cone, which of course you can't see unless you developed some special powers by meditation. But if you could see it, then you would see that um, beings who are called gods and demigods live in the upper levels. By the way, in Buddhism, Buddhism recognizes the existence of beings who are called gods, but there's really kind of nothing special about them because we all have been gods. We've also all been demigods and different types of animals, and we've been hungry ghosts, and we've been hell beings, and all the different types of beings there are in the cosmos. We've all been them many times because we've all been endlessly reincarnated. Gods happen to live for a long time, but then they die, and then they're reborn in some other way. So, in fact, being a human being is the best of all of these because we have a nice blend of suffering and leisure and fortune. So we can appreciate what's being taught by Buddhism and do its practice. Another way to look at this is this way. The figure on the right is the outer rings, which represent the different elements, and then the grounds of the palace. And then if you go to the left, the next square is the bottommost foundation of the palace. To the left of it is the layer of the palace that sits on top of that, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see that the palace has these 5 levels. And this is how you would imagine it three-dimensionally. Someone who is practicing Kalachakra should imagine themselves to be the Buddha Kalachakra, and there are instructions for what the Buddha Kalachakra looks like. And then you imagine yourself being in the center of this palace, and you have to imagine everything about this palace too, and everything about the rings. Um, I think this is amazing, and I can't believe that anyone could do it. But they say that there are people who are capable of doing it, and that in fact, every time the initiation is given, there is someone who meets the actual Buddha Kalachakra, that is to say, turns into Buddha Kalachakra themselves. By the way, being one Buddha or another doesn't really matter because all Buddhas can take any form they want to, whatever would be helpful to anybody else. So they're kind of interchangeable that way. But, for doing a specific practice, you need to think of yourself in a specific way. This is another three-dimensional rendering of the Kalachakra mandala, um, which is in some library somewhere. I'm not even, I think in India, but I'm not sure. I say library because if you look at behind it on the left and on the right, those stacks of orange things, those are actually Tibetan books. Tibetan books are long and thin traditionally, and then are wrapped in orange cloth. And they have a little flap in the front that you can lift so you can see what the title of the book is. So this is a library, and in it is this three-dimensional model of the Kalachakra mandala. Like I say, imagining this, an incredible feat. So I want a few other notes before we leave. Um, all around the place, you see lots of mantras on stones and put in various places. A lot are printed on flags that are flown, either vertical flags or horizontal collections of flags. And I don't know, you can find them in all sorts of places. Anyway, like I said, they're utterances in Sanskrit that distill the essence of a particular bodhisattva or Buddha. And people will refer to them as prayers, but they're part of a practice that involves imagining yourself to be the Bodhisattva or Buddha. So it's really your speech. Like you imagine yourself to be Chenrezig, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And then what do you say? You say, Om Mani Padme Hum, although Tibetans pronounce it Om Mani Padme Hum. So literally, this means Om, jewel, lotus, Hum. So it has many levels of symbolism, but at its most basic, it means the union of wisdom and compassion. Jewel and lotus mean wisdom and compassion. So, uh, the other mantras are longer generally, but have the same basic meaning, let's say. So, like I say, we saw lots of prayer flags. Mantras are printed on flags. And the idea is that every time the flag flaps, it's like sending this out into the universe. Often the flags will have a wind horse printed in the middle of them. The wind horse carries a wish-fulfilling jewel. You can also see often a tiger, an eagle or Garuda, a snow lion, kind of special symbol of Tibet, or a dragon. And these represent these different kinds of qualities. So again, it's just a way of sending out good wishes into the world. I explained the symbolism of the deer and the wheel before. This picture may show you a little bit more clearly what's there. Other common symbols are footprint, like, the Buddha didn't leave anything but footprints behind. But if you look carefully at the footprints, you'll see a wheel because he had a wheel on his feet. I mean, not like a tattoo, but like something that would stand out so that after he walked on the earth, he would leave these prints behind. And then a lotus. A lotus represents enlightenment because it's a flower that starts in the mud at the bottom of murky water, but comes up to the top and then unfurls pristinely. So it's like, we work with the mud of the world, but we can get to a point where we perfect ourselves, where we lose our ignorance, ill will, and greed, and become, what we potentially can be, which is a Buddha. You also saw these auspicious signs or symbols in many places around the library, especially, but I'm sure also at the Kalachakra temple. So these are ancient symbols um, of enlightenment or of compassion or of spreading the Dharma or, various things like that. So I just wanted to list them. I just want you to know that's what they were. They're just kind of lucky signs. Um, Also, you often see these five qualities. You might see this painted at the bottom of one of these paintings, or you might see it someplace else. But the mirror represents the sense of sight, incense of smell, fruits of taste, the veena, which is a South Indian instrument that's like the sitar of North India, representing sound, and silk, representing touch. You might also see at the bottom of paintings like this one, if you look at the left, you see this collection of things at the bottom. Um, and these are the seven gems, which are also auspicious. Some, really unique, unusual things that could be offered um, to the Buddha. And finally, this is a picture of the Buddha in the library, in the great room of the library. And I just wanted to point out that this is a very common image of the Buddha. It depicts the moment that he is about to attain enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Um, Supposedly, um, his opponent, Mara, um, who is kind of God, who doesn't want him to achieve enlightenment, says, "Well, who are you? Who can vouch for you that you have done everything that you need to do to attain enlightenment?" And it said that the Buddha touched the earth with one finger. The earth quaked, flowers fell down from the trees and everything. And Mara realized the earth herself was vouching for the Buddha. And then Mara withdrew, and then the Buddha quickly, that very night, attained enlightenment. So the Buddha always has a bump on his head, and that actually is supposed to represent the fact that his skull expanded to, contain his wisdom after the time of enlightenment. It's not just, in other words, hair. Um, he's dressed as a monk. He's got a begging bowl, and he's surrounded by temptations and enemies, which, as the story goes, turned into flowers after the earth vouched for him. And that's the end. So anyway, I hope that some of these images and my explanation of them answered some questions for you if you had them, or anyway, further explain things. And now, if you have any questions you'd like to ask me about anything, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Um, can you go into more detail? You said that you mentioned it, and then you said that's a long story about how the Dalai Lama was chosen
Oh yeah, okay.
or discovered, or
I'll try to make it short. Um, when somebody like the Dalai Lama dies, they look immediately for any signs that might point to where they should look for the reincarnation. Sometimes these people leave a letter behind indicating this, but the 13th Dalai Lama did not do so. However, after um, he died in a meditation posture, and this is very common too. I don't know whether that actually happened or not, but that's what they say. So they don't immediately cremate you. They wait several days because the idea is that um, you can stay in what's called the clear mind of death for up to 3 days, kind of a meditation thing. Anyway, people would come into the 13th Dalai Lama's room, and every time they did, they found his head had turned towards the northeast. There was also a growth of some fungus on the northeast side of a pillar in the room, which didn't make any sense. There were flowers that bloomed out of season on the northeast side of the building. There were cloud formations that went over that were headed towards the northeast. So all of this was carefully recorded, and well, maybe we should be looking towards the northeast. Then, after a couple of years, the regent went to a sacred lake and did a meditation practice there and had a vision. And in the lake, he saw a house with a turquoise colored roof and kind of a funny shape. And he saw a much bigger building, which might have been a monastery. And he saw three Tibetan letters, A, Pa, and Ma. So he brought back this vision and told others about it. And eventually they figured out that the A must stand for the Amdo region of Tibet up in the northeast. That Ka might refer to Kumbum Monastery, which was, up there, very important monastery. Ma, they didn't know what the meaning of was until they got up there and found a village that started with that sound. Um, so then they were in the right area anyway. So they sent teams of monks out disguised as um, traders. And, they went to various places and they tried very surreptitiously to find out about children who were the right age to be the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. Um, and so they did so in the region near Kumbha Monastery. And one of the children they found who was just the right age happened to live in a house that had this turquoise roof that was shaped in this particular way. I think there was something about a little brown dog too, but I may be getting that wrong. Anyway, then they took that child and several other children and they gave them a test. They uh, put out in a room, they had a big table and they put on it items that had belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama, like like his cane. He had several canes. He had a, a gong. He had a bell. He had eyeglasses. He had a bowl that he ate out of. Uh, a bunch of things like that. And then they put on other items, other eyeglasses, other canes, other bowls and things like that. So the idea was to see whether or not the children could identify what had belonged to them a few years earlier when they were the 13th Dalai Lama. And this particular child passed the test with flying colors, identifying everything. There seemed to be one problem where he wasn't sure about a particular cane. It turned out that that cane had belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama only temporarily, and he'd given it to somebody else. So that explained that. Anyway, they were very sure that they'd gotten the right child. By the way, if you're interested, there's a great movie about the early life of the Dalai Lama called Kundun, Kundun, and it's directed by Martin Scorsese, who's one of the greatest filmmakers on the planet. It was made in the 90s sometime. Um, and so it depicts this scene where he's chosen um, very well, nicely. Anyway, I think so. That's how they find a Dalai Lama. Now, the next one might be a different story altogether because the 14th Dalai Lama has warned that he may choose to appoint somebody to be the Dalai Lama rather than reincarnating. And remember, he's supposed to be Chenrezig, willingly, on his own volition, reincarnating as a Dalai Lama. If he says, I'm not coming back, then he's not coming back, right? If he says, I'm going to appoint somebody instead, then everybody has to accept that's how it's going to be from now on. So somebody has been identified as the probable person who he's going to appoint. But he has said in the past that when he reaches about age 90, he'll consult with leaders of Tibetan Buddhism, the leaders of the monastic traditions, and make a decision about what to do. Well, he's going to be 89 in July. So we're only a year or so away from when this final decision will be made, if he, I hope, lives, to be able to do that. Um, he's, he's doing okay, but he has to be helped while walking these days and stuff like that. So anyway, yes, I think Mary, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Why would he choose not to be reincarnated? What's the reasoning behind that?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. It's because they're quite worried that the Chinese
Uh-huh.
will find some boy, probably boy, and say, this is the Dalai Lama, and then they will control that person
Yeah.
and make him, say what they want or
Mhm.
else disappear him.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if he appoints somebody, then how do you move forward from there without a Dalai Lama?
Well, that person will be the Dalai Lama, but I don't know how it will work from that point. Will that person, they should have a system whereby that person appoints a Dalai Lama in waiting,
Yeah.
like a vice Dalai Lama, a Dalai Lama elect, right?
So could he do that now? Could he appoint
He
somebody?
could, and maybe he will, but I just know that in the past, about 10 years ago, he said, when I get to be 90, then I'll do this
Make a decision. Mhm.
decision.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
if his health took a turn for the worse, he might speed that up.
But
I don't.
that's really taking a chance because, nobody knows when they're going to die, obviously.
Exactly, right. Except I think Tibetans would say, oh, His Holiness, he knows exactly when he's going to die. Because
Until it doesn't.
he's not an ordinary human being. They
Right.
both think of him as an ordinary human being and as somebody who can break the rules if he wants to. He's obviously had illnesses and, troubles of various sorts in the past. So he's an ordinary human being that way. I I, I don't know. They think of him as being like the newspapers often say God King, when they describe the Dalai Lama. And, technically, he's not a king, never was, and he's not a god either. He's a human bodhisattva. But anyway, Tibetans really, they fall down on their faces when they meet His Holiness. It's really quite intense for them.
Wow. Big chance to take.
Yeah. Abby?
Did um did they prepare the family at all prior to their discovery, or do they just accept
Yeah,
it?
it actually took a while because
Yeah.
that region of Amdo was under the control of, well, sometimes it's described as a Chinese warlord. I would
Mm.
say it was under the control of a gangster. He was basically a mob leader who, controlled that area, and they had to bribe him to get the child out of there. And that took a while, because they were 1,000 miles from Lhasa, and the only way to get back and forth was on horseback. So negotiations took time. So during that time, the family prepared themselves to make the move to Lhasa, and they all went. I the brother, his older brother, had been already recognized as a Lama himself and was at Kumbum Monastery. But I think he came to Lhasa too. So he had at least two other brothers. He had three brothers, I think, and a sister, and a father and a mother. And they had a palace in Lhasa called the Norbulinka, or Summer Palace. And they all lived there. So as a child, His Holiness saw his family quite often. But he himself was made to live in that Potala Palace, uh, and had highly supervised study and everything. And he says that he was quite lonely as a child. That his main playmates were actually household staff like cleaners who would play with him. And he had a telescope, and he liked looking down from the roof of the Potala at the ordinary people of Lhasa, to see what their life was like, which he couldn't share because he was, trapped in this palace, so to speak. By the way, I mentioned before that after the fifth Dalai Lama died, that it took 17 years before they identified the next one. Well, that guy wasn't at all sure he wanted to be a Dalai Lama. For one thing, he didn't really want to be a monk. Um, he liked women. And he would look down uh, and even look at the prisoners in a jail at the foot of the Potala Palace, and he would envy them because at least they got to, kind of be out and to talk to each other. Whereas he was trying, anyway, the story is that he would sneak out of the Potala Palace at night, dressed as a layperson, and go down to the bars and brothels of Lhasa and, drink and enjoy the company of women, and then sneak back in and become the Dalai Lama again. And his only literary work was a volume of poetry, and most of the poems are romantic or even erotic poetry. But because Tibetans like to at least pretend that, he was highly spiritual, they interpret these erotic poems in a spiritual way. I just think that's kind of fun. Um,
I
you know,
just
some
want to say there are a couple books in the library on him,
right.
or some excerpts of him.
He's
He
quite
only
he's
had to be like 17, right?
right. He was, yeah. So he was already almost an adult, and yeah, the life of a monk trapped in this palace was not really what he wanted. But, to
How
his
long
credit,
how long did he was his reign, or that's the word you use? How long did he reign? Was he the
I
Dalai Lama for?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. I'm sorry.
That's
I
okay.
don't I don't think he was one of the ones that was poisoned though. There were several Dalai Lamas that were poisoned as children, And so the succession happened kind of quickly.
Wow.
So the fifth Dalai Lama lived for quite a while and did a lot. So he's the great fifth Dalai Lama. And some of the other ones, like the seventh Dalai Lama, was really quite an academic, quite a great scholar. Some of the other Dalai Lamas didn't leave that much of a mark. Hmm. So, I just wanted to mention the name of the library is the Great 14th Dalai Lama Library. I think what the Tibetans are trying to say by saying great is that a few of the Dalai Lamas, like the fifth Dalai Lama, were better than the rest. And the 14th is one of them. So let's call him the Great 14th. And, frankly, given what he's accomplished in his lifetime, uh, written an amazing number of books, um, traveled all over the world, you become, an important spiritual figure and to some extent a political figure too. I think you'd have to say he deserves to be called great. Well, anybody else got a question about any old thing?
I'm
Well,
curious if I can go ahead. Go ahead, Mary Ellen.
Bronwyn had a
No, I
question.
didn't have a question. No,
He was muted.
I was going to wrap up, but you go, Abby.
You want to wrap it up now?
No,
Is that
Well,
what you-
I
Oh,
thought I think Bronwyn had a
okay.
question, but
go ahead.
he was muted. So if you just unmute yourself,
There?
yeah.
There.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was a very lucid talk. And now I want to put to you a question that somebody asked me the other day, and I had to kind of fumble with the answer. How is it, do you think, that the current Dalai Lama has achieved this worldwide status and recognition as a wise and presumably holy man by anybody's reckoning? Why do we all care so much?
Yeah. Uh, he left Tibet as a young man. Um, and I think the world was really captivated by his escape from Tibet and what happened to him afterwards. He was very famous by April 1959 when he appeared on the cover of Time magazine. I remember a long time ago I read a novel by John Updike called Rabbit Run. It was
Yes.
one of his best. And sort of at the beginning, Rabbit is listening to the radio, and they're wondering, where is the Dalai Lama? So I mean, that was
Yeah.
really well known. And then, of course, he's in India, and for a long time, really the only people who knew about him were people who traveled to India and, went to go and see him. Among them, Sidney Pyburn, who
Yeah.
eventually helped to establish Namgyal here and everything. Um, but then, he began to be invited to go to outside of India. I think in 1979 or 1980 was the first time he was invited to the United States. Um, I remember that when he came to visit, he came to Charlottesville. His translator at the time was my dissertation advisor, Jeffrey Hopkins.
Yes,
Uh,
indeed.
Jeffrey had gone to see him in 1972 or 1973 when he was
Yeah.
doing his own dissertation research. He was getting a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. Anyway,
Yeah.
so he went there and he was already fluent in Tibetan because he had been living with lamas in New Jersey at what now is called the Tibetan Buddhist Learning Center. And he was
Yes.
impressed with the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama was really impressed with him. So, the Dalai Lama started to make connections with scholars, in the United States and elsewhere. Um, so he came to the United States. When he came to Charlottesville, he had a few security people. That's all. And so no big entourage, and it was like no big deal. And I remember he spoke at the medical school, in an auditorium there, and he talked about what happens at death and after death. And he did that because Ian Stevenson, who was a professor at the University of Virginia Medical School, had been doing research at that point for 20 years on reincarnation, stories of children who remembered past lives. And he went all over the world to investigate these things. An effort which, by the way, is ongoing still today at the University of Virginia Medical School. He gave this talk, and he also came to Jeffrey's house in his basement, which had been transformed into a kind of temple. And about 30 of us fit in there. And he gave a talk about how there shouldn't be any sectarianism in Tibetan Buddhism, how the Nyingma tradition and the Gelugpa tradition were really, coming at things the same way. So it's been kind of a gradual thing of people being so impressed by hearing him, as he traveled in the world, that it just increased the interest for more people to ask him to come to more places. And, and of course, he was always being asked about Tibet and China, wherever he went. So he was being a statesman at the same time, suggesting, for instance, that, Buddhism and Marxism were compatible. And, I think they are really.
Sure.
And that Tibet didn't have to be independent of China. It just had to be autonomous. I mean, you can handle the foreign policy and the army and everything. We just want to carry on the way we were, and especially with regard to our religion. Just let us manage our own little affairs in our own little corner of China. We don't care if you call us China, part of China. However, this was never accepted. He was always being depicted by the Chinese as a splittist, or many other terms they gave to him. Never accepted any of his proposals for peace and so on. So we're still pretty much have the situation we did in 1959. Only it's really been getting progressively worse.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's his compassion and his skill at speaking and connecting to audiences
Yeah.
that has made him very popular around the world.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah.
You're welcome. It'd be really fantastic, in my view, if he there's been a rumor for a long time that he might retire here.
Oh,
We'll have an apartment for him at the back of the temple. He could retire to Dukor Chuling. I don't know if he will, but he'd be out of India. He'd be away from all of that. The new Dalai Lama, the appointed one, would have a chance to, be the public face. So if you get a chance, tell him come to Ithaca. Okay.
Amazing thought.
Yeah.
I also thought I heard on the radio the other day that he's going to live to be 130. What he predicts. I'm not saying that's true, but I think I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. At this point, I'm just praying that he lives to be 90 because he's had some, health problems and he's not steady on his feet anymore. But, he's still giving teachings. I, saw a picture of him from about 3 days ago giving teachings in India. And of course, he had, three guys helping him walk to and from the place where he was teaching, but he's still lucid. Okay, that's
One
it.
more.
Okay.
What are the chances going forward that the Dalai Lama would ever be a woman?
Well, he himself has said that he might reincarnate as a woman. It was a little controversial because he said, I would reincarnate as a beautiful woman because people take beautiful women more seriously.
I think it's just the opposite, actually.
Well, yeah. He's a monk, so I think we should give him a little slack, but Um, there's never been a female, Dalai Lama, of course. There are many tulkus who are female, not nearly as many as male ones, um, but they're quite important in the religion too. And to go back and forth is something that has happened with other lines of tulkus, just not the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lamas have always been male up to this point. So that would be interesting.
Yeah. There, I can't cite because I read it a couple of weeks ago. It must have been in either the Washington Post or the New York Times. There was this is a bit of a divergence, but about the studies at the University of Virginia Medical School and of children with
Yes.
past lives. That was really interesting.
Yes, I saw that. In fact, as a consequence, I recently obtained the books that it was being referred to there. Um, Ian Stevenson, I think, did this research for about 35 years. But in the last part of it, he was being assisted by Jim Tucker, who is an MD, um, and got interested in this subject, and who has carried on from Stevenson.
Yeah.
And so Tucker's written a couple of books himself, about the recollections of children, um, uh, and it might even have been American children, were being talked about there.
I
It
think
actually,
that's that was the article, but it
yeah,
was kind of
I think it actually started with a book called After, which is also by a physician who was interested in near-death experiences, and the characteristics of the near-death experiences and what they might say about the possibility of reincarnation. And he referred to the foundation for his own research being the work of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker. So that's how they got into the article.
yeah. It's just I think you could find it. Anybody who's interested, it was really recent in the newspaper,
Right.
like
Right.
like in the past couple of weeks. So it was a really interesting article.
I would just like to say that I was always very skeptical about reincarnation because it seemed to be too good to be true. You know, that this isn't the only life we have. We'll have another life after, before. Of course, it won't be the same life at all, and you won't remember this one. But still, it was like hopeful, right? And then I picked up Stevenson's first book, which is called 20 Cases, uh, something about reincarnation, indicative of or suggestive of reincarnation. And then I read them, and there was one story in particular that just kind of bowled me over. It was about a Sri Lankan kid, who had said, well, my family is in such and such a village, which was on the other side of the island. Um, Stevenson heard about this, however, and he put the entire family, including this kid, on a train, and they went across Sri Lanka to this village. And when they got there, none of them had ever been more than 10 miles from their village, by the way. They got there, kid jumps out of the train, starts running through the streets, and these other people are running after them, right? Kid runs to this house, knocks on the door, door opens, kid identifies all of the people in the house and asks, "Where's the tree?" Well, it turns out that there was a big tree in the front yard of this house, but after the previous person had died, it was cut down and the stump was taken out. So there's no trace of a tree being there at all. And the kid's asking what happened to the tree. I mean, like, at the end of the book, Stevenson says, well, what hypotheses might account for this evidence? And he goes through a bunch of things. And frankly, reincarnation was the least weird of all of them. There were ones like, mass hypnosis, or that after we die, our memories go out in space somewhere, and then, they can be picked up by somebody who can channel them later. I mean, that's even weirder than reincarnation, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
But the,
my skepticism started to erode. And then in India, I met some young tulkus, and they were not normal people. I mean, like, a 4-year-old kid who could go back and forth between being like a 4-year-old kid and being like a 40-year-old man. I mean, it's it
yeah,
makes you think.
yeah,
Uh, I mean, Asians in general, I mean, reincarnation, sure. I mean, that's what everybody believes. And they can identify plenty of people, who remember past lives and stuff like that. Here in the West, no, that's not what we think happens. But maybe we're wrong.
yeah. Well, the article gave an example that really freaked me out, because it was apparently one of the ideas behind it is that it's young children can be more identifiers of that, and then as they get older, the memories are reduced.
Right.
And it was a young girl, literally like a 3-year-old or maybe a 4-year-old, who was having nightmares and having this, what her parents thought was an imaginary friend. And she was talking about, I miss my children and I have a number tattooed on my arm. I mean, this is like a 4-year-old
Yeah.
girl.
Right.
And these are not weird people reporting on this. These are,
Yeah.
scientists doing studies. Oh my
Well,
God,
well,
creeped
quite
me out.
often the parents are deeply disturbed by the fact
Yeah.
that the kid is, and the reason why there are more stories of this sort is that people treat it as a fantasy
Yeah.
and don't take it seriously, and then the child drops it after a while.
Yeah.
But I know with my own kids, I used to say, "Who are you?" and ask, trying to get them to, give me some grounds to interrogate them further, but
You
didn't
don't
happen.
ask them that. You don't ask them that when they're teenagers, because they say, "I must have had bad karma to be
Oh,
reincarnated with you as parents."
no, I was asking them as soon as they could possibly talk, but it didn't bear fruit in my case. It was fun though. So yeah, like I said, I just recently obtained these books, so I'm gonna immerse myself some more in this. And there's also a book by my friend Roger Jackson, who taught for a long time at Carleton College in Minnesota. And he's written a book called Rebirth, which is about every aspect of the whole uh, rebirth doctrine that exists in Indian and Tibetan Buddhism. So I'm going to read that too. Something I've saved for retirement. Anyway, we
Well,
should probably end this, huh?